Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, global citizens and sovereign citizens, welcome to Clarifying Catholicism. You're watching part 23 of a series on the history of the Ecumenical Councils according to the Catholic Church. Today we are covering the Second Vatican Council. Much of the information was gathered from Joseph Kelly's The Ecumenical Councils of the Catholic Church, a History. So if you want an in-depth dive into these topics, make sure to pick up a copy of his book. To see the rest of our episodes, check out our playlist in the description. Without further ado, on to the show. If the way church teaching is expressed and applied depends on changing cultural situations, then post-World War II Europe presented the church with uncharted waters. Thus, the story of the church from Vatican I to Vatican II can be explained by the church's changing relationship to the modern world. Whereas the church's experience with early liberal philosophy and secular governments came with much violence, such as the French Revolution, the church's perception of liberalism vastly changed in the 20th century. This was largely due to two factors: the emergence of the United States as a powerful model of the compatibility between liberalism and Catholicism, and the rise of the only major alternative to a liberal democracy being the authoritarian state, such as Nazi Germany. If Gallicanism, or the allegiance of clergy to the state over the church, scared the church in the 1800s, as mentioned in our last episode, then the prospect of a Nazi or Soviet conquest of Europe likely terrified the papacy. After World War II, the church was welcomed into international discourse as a social rather than political institution. It's remarkable that only by not tethering itself to a specific nation or political movement, the church was finally able to break regional boundaries by preaching to people regardless of culture or country. In many ways, the church's commitment to politics before held back its ability to evangelize. The separation of church and state that Europeans used to persecute clerics had turned into a mechanism by which clerics were shielded from the messiness of politics. In an age in which various religions were no longer existential threats to each other, the church learned how to appreciate how other religions can be stepping stones to Christ. The same media platforms that had been weaponized by monarchs to misinterpret the Bible were accessible to the public for use in discourse. Thus, by the time of Pius XII's papacy in the 1950s, the church was open to philosophies and ways of thinking it had shunned for years. But with so much animosity having been exhibited against the modern world in the past, the church needed to do something monumental to show its commitment to some of these new ideas. So, Pope John XXIII, elected in 1959, called an Ecumenical Council, Vatican II, not for the purpose of focusing on one dogma or doctrine, but to reapply already existing doctrines to modern issues and re-expressing them using modern philosophical language. There's a common misconception that Vatican II holds less magisterial weight than other councils because John XXIII stated they were not defining any new doctrines. At the council's opening, attendance consisted of 1,041 European bishops, 956 American bishops, 379 African bishops, and 300 Asian bishops. This was, by far, the most well-represented church council, globally speaking. Despite this diversity, the planning committees were quite conservative and very Roman-centric. It was so Roman-centric that when the first session began in 1962, the international bishops demanded that voting on council leadership be delayed so that non-Romans could have a better chance of leading the council. This delay made the council leadership quite diverse, both geographically and intellectually. After voting on leadership, the first document they worked on concerned the liturgy. It eventually became known as Sacrosanctum Concilium. The document advocated for active participation in the liturgy, allowed for the translation of the Mass into local languages, and emphasized the role of local bishops. It was during this session in which bishops stated rather boldly that Latin was not the language of the whole Church, but just of the Roman Rite. The next document they worked on covered proper scriptural interpretation. The first draft of the document was overwhelmingly criticized for being too rigid and conservative. 2/3 of the bishops wanted to scrap it, but instead, Pope John XXIII asked for leaders of both the conservative and progressive factions to draft the new version of the document together, the epitome of compromise. The document eventually became known as De Verbum. The last document from the first session was on ecclesiology. Like the last one, the Planning Committee's proposal was criticized for an overly conservative tone. The document was eventually reworked into Lumen Gentium, which would take a far kinder view of other Christian churches and non-Christian religions. Pope John XXIII fell ill with stomach cancer. As his condition worsened, he wrote an encyclical, Pacem in Terris, which was addressed to all men of goodwill rather than simply bishops or Catholics. The encyclical addressed the topic of world peace and human rights. It embodied the Holy Father's desire to address and engage the modern world. After John's death, the cardinals elected Pope Paul VI, who was determined to finish the council. The second session began in 1963. One of its aims was to better define the relationship between the authority of the bishops and that of the Holy Father. Later, they turned their attention to ecumenism, or the quest for unity between Christian churches. Notably, the document they came up with avoided the language of referring to Protestants and Orthodox as heretics and schismatics. It called them brethren instead. Later chapters of this work made positive statements about Judaism and validated religious freedom, which, as many of you recall, was harshly condemned by some 1800s popes. Finally, towards the end of the second session, Pope Paul announced a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, where he would meet with the Patriarch of Constantinople. This was a significant move, since the Catholic Church tended to shy away from ecumenicism before Vatican II. To sum up this shift in perspective, the Church went from seeing other Christian denominations and sects as evil heretics who needed to beg for forgiveness, to separated brethren who sought truth just as Catholics do. The third session opened in 1964. It focused on Lumen Gentium, from which a notable linguistic development was made. Rather than say the Catholic Church is the Church of Christ, as many pre-Vatican II theologians opined, Lumen Gentium instead used the language that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. This is significant because instead of saying that the visible Catholic Church is the only mechanism for salvation, it is possible for people who are not visibly inside the Church to be saved. Since although the Church of Christ exists in its fullest extent in the Catholic Church, aspects of it can exist in other religions as well. This session also gave birth to Nostra Aetate, which spoke of other religions, such as Judaism and Islam, in very positive terms. This session also inaugurated work on Vatican II's final constitution, Gaudium et Spes, the document on the Church and the modern world. This document notably drew from many philosophical sources, both Thomistic and non-Thomistic. It addressed modern problems like nuclear war and racism, while it stressed how the Church must play an active role in ensuring the good of all humankind, not just her visible members. Work continued on several documents, and later that year, Pope Paul lifted his excommunication on the Greek Orthodox, a major ecumenical step. This marks the end of the ecumenical councils for now. Next episode will be our final one, and it'll look at a few trends that we've noticed throughout these councils. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.